Welcome back to Panda's Nightmares. Tonight, we're diving into the scariest real-life experiences people have ever lived through. These are the moments that left them shaken, terrified, and questioning everything around them. From eerie encounters to life-threatening situations, these stories are as bone-chilling as they are unforgettable. Before we begin, I want to share something close to my heart. I'm raising funds for my dad's medical treatment, and your support would mean the world to me. If you'd like to help, the GoFundMe link is in the description below. Thank you for being here, and now, let's get into these terrifying tales. Story 1. When I was around 10 to 12 years old, my family went rustic camping in Pennsylvania. One night, as I lay in my small two-person tent with only my friend, I heard heavy, crunching footsteps outside. Then came the breathing low, grunting, sniffing sound that grew louder with each passing moment. I immediately assumed it was a bear, though I will never know for certain. The creature began circling the tent, its nose pressing against the thin fabric. I lay as still as possible, trembling with fear, fully expecting to be eaten alive at any moment. To my terror, the bear eventually settled down right next to the tent, its body pressing against the fabric so firmly that I had to pull my legs up to avoid touching it. I am not sure if I passed out from fear or somehow managed to fall asleep, but by morning, I initially thought it was all just a bad dream. That was until I saw the flat spot on the ground outside the tent, where the leaves were cleared from where the bear had been lying. Story 2. My wife and I had been living together for a few years when we moved into a 2-level apartment. Not long after, I began to hear something unsettling. A child's scream. It was just one scream at a time, sharp and anguished, and definitely coming from inside the apartment. It would happen once every few days, completely at random, sometimes in the dead of night, sometimes in broad daylight. The scream always startled me. I'd jump up and search the entire apartment, desperate to figure out where it was coming from. But it was so brief and unexpected that I could never pinpoint the source. After several weeks of this, my nerves were completely shot. The screams that came around for AM were the worst. They jolted me out of bed, heart pounding, and I'd end up pacing the apartment, trying to calm myself down. It would take ages for me to fall back asleep. I told friends and family about it, hoping someone might have an explanation, but the mystery persisted. Then one day, while I was cleaning my office, the scream happened again, this time, right next to me. I nearly jumped out of my skin, thinking my life was in immediate danger. But then I turned and saw my computer screen. My screensaver was an old 3D South Park animation featuring Kenny, who would occasionally float around and get stabbed by a spear. Even though the computer's sound was set to OFF, somehow, every few days, it still managed to play Kenny's agonized scream at full volume. I felt like an absolute idiot, but also overwhelmingly relieved. No ghost child, no haunting, just a rogue screensaver. Story 3. Not my story, but my girlfriend's back when she was 18, about 8 years ago. Her family went on a month-long holiday to the United States, traveling to all the classic spots: Washington, D.C., New York City, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. Their standard hotel routine was for her parents to share one room while she shared another with her brother. When they arrived in San Francisco, they settled into their hotel room as usual. She freshened up her makeup, her brother was in the bathroom, and they were getting ready to head out for dinner. Everything seemed normal, and they left to enjoy their evening. Later that night, they returned to the room. My girlfriend headed straight for the bathroom, and that's when things took a horrifying turn. While standing in front of the mirror, she caught a glimpse of the shower curtain behind her. It wasn't just a shower curtain. It was clear that someone was standing behind it. Terrified, she ran out of the bathroom and told her brother. Instead of immediately leaving the room, they panicked and called room service from inside the room. Room service instructed them to leave the room immediately without packing anything. It turned out a man had been in the bathroom the entire time, even while her brother had been in there earlier. The police were called, but the family was never told who the man was or what his intentions might have been. To this day, my girlfriend always checks behind shower curtains whenever we're staying somewhere unfamiliar. That experience left a lasting mark, and honestly, I can't blame her. Story 4. When I worked as an EMT in a rough Rust Belt city, I had my share of wild calls, but one night stands out as the most terrifying. My partner and I were dispatched to a fire standby in a sketchy neighborhood. It was routine until the fire department asked us to take a look at a man who had cut his arm. The man they brought over was massive, easily 6 feet 8 inches and about 300 pounds. He reeked of alcohol, his speech was slurred, and he could barely walk straight. Though we couldn't officially say he was drunk, the signs were clear. He had a superficial cut on his arm, nothing serious, so we patched him up and loaded him into the ambulance. As we were en route to the hospital, my partner abruptly pulled over. She told me dispatch had given direct orders to return to the fire scene. This was odd, I'd never been told to return to a scene mid-transport. To make things worse, the orders included not informing the patient about the change. Sitting in the back with this hulking, drunk man, I was not thrilled. When he noticed the U-turn, the man started asking questions. I deflected, pretending I didn't know. We pulled up to the scene to find the fire trucks gone, replaced by 2 plainclothes fire police officers. They asked us to stay in the ambulance while they spoke to the patient. Then they asked both my partner and me to sit in the back with them, making it clear they were nervous about handling this guy alone. The questioning quickly escalated. The man claimed he had been helping the firefighters. The officers pointed out that his fingerprints were found inside the house, but he was seen approaching from outside only after the fire had started. When they mentioned his outdated volunteer fire department t-shirt belonging to a group disbanded years ago, his story began to unravel. Finally, one officer bluntly said, "I think you started that fire." That's when things went sideways. The man, strapped into our stretcher with every restraint available, suddenly lunged forward. He grabbed one of the officers, jostling the entire stretcher. The other officer tried to pull his partner free, while I instinctively threw open the side door and pushed my partner out of the ambulance for her safety. The fire police managed to free themselves and tumble out of the back. Now it was just me and the raging drunk. He began thrashing, trying to undo the straps and grab me. I froze, unsure whether to help or flee, until I saw the fire police outside, drawing their guns. They aimed at the man, but with the large oxygen tank and me in the back, an accidental explosion was a very real risk. I scrambled out of the side door, narrowly avoiding a panic attack. My partner yelled at the fire police not to shoot while I ran to the front to kill the engine and grab the keys, ensuring the man couldn't drive off. The patient, now unrestrained, began tearing apart the ambulance interior and throwing items out the back. At one point, a portable oxygen tank went flying. Finally, we heard the rumble of a fire truck speeding down the street. Half a dozen firefighters jumped off with halogen bars and surrounded the man. Realizing he was outnumbered, the patient hesitated, then slowly set the oxygen tank down. The firefighters tackled him, cuffing him until more police arrived to haul him away. That night, I learned what true terror felt like. Standing on a dark street, watching a man wielding an oxygen tank as a weapon, and knowing the smallest wrong move could turn everything into chaos. It's something I'll never forget. Story 5. Well, I was home alone one afternoon, pretending to be sick like I used to in high school. It was around 3 p.m. on a Friday when I heard a knock at the door. My brother was always too lazy to get his keys out, so I assumed it was him. But I thought, no way, I'm not getting the door. Then, the knocking turned into relentless doorbell ringing, and I started to get annoyed. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and I heard someone walking inside. At first I thought it was my mum coming home early from grocery shopping. But then I heard a man's voice yelling, "Alex," a name I didn't recognize. That's when I realized someone had broken into the house. I was sitting in my bedroom, which was directly across from the staircase. My heart stopped as I saw a man walking up the stairs, holding a crowbar in his hand. Panicking, the only thing I could think to say was, "No one here is named Alex." The man froze, looked at me, and said, "Sorry, miss," in a weirdly polite tone. Classic Canadian home invasion, I guess. Then he turned and bolted out of the house. The moment he left, I completely broke down and started crying hysterically. I couldn't sleep for days after that. Even now, I hate being home alone. My house didn't feel like mine anymore, it felt violated. What made it worse was that I had been having nightmares about this kind of situation since I was 9 years old. I'm just grateful nothing worse happened because, at the time, I was a 17-year-old girl sitting alone in my room. Story 6. My uncle owns a large 100-plus acre farm in North Carolina, where I would often spend summer vacations with my cousins. One year, in the late 1980s, when I was about 7 or 8 years old, my brother and I woke up in the middle of the night for no apparent reason. Unable to fall back asleep, we sat by the second-story window, chatting and gazing out at the farm. From our vantage point, we had a clear view of the large, old farmhouse about 30 yards away. This farmhouse, built in the 1880s, had been sitting abandoned for decades. It was the textbook definition of a creepy, stereotypical haunted house. While we were looking over at it, my brother and I suddenly noticed something in the southwest corner window on the second floor, a blue-gray glowing figure, unmistakably shaped like a person, staring directly at us. The figure was clear as day, and we both froze in absolute terror. Panicking, we ran to wake up my dad and told him what we had seen. He followed us back to the window, but by the time he looked, the figure was gone. Though he dismissed it, my brother and I knew exactly what we had seen. Fast forward 8 years. I was 16 years old and visiting the farm again. For some reason, my aunt and uncle had to take my cousin somewhere and gave me the option to tag along or stay back at the farm. Sensing a rare moment of alone time, I jumped at the chance to stay. The day was overcast, so I decided to stick close to the house in case of rain. I wandered to the trampoline, which was just a few yards from the old farmhouse, and began jumping and flipping to pass the time. About 10 minutes in, I suddenly felt an intense, paralyzing sensation, as though something was staring directly at me. It was so overwhelming that I froze mid-jump, and in that instant, the memory of the glowing figure from 8 years earlier came flooding back. Slowly, I turned my head toward the southwest second-story window of the old farmhouse, and there it was. The same blue-gray glow, the same outfit, the same eerie, unblinking stare. I turned away, trying to brush it off, but the sensation of being watched was unbearable, like a hand pressing down on my shoulder. I kept jumping, trying to act as though I hadn't seen it, but after another minute or two, I couldn't help myself. I glanced back, and it was still there, completely unchanged, still staring at me. At that moment, I lost every ounce of courage I had. I bolted back to the main house as fast as I could, ran into my cousin's room, shut the blinds, and sat trembling in fear until my aunt, uncle, and cousins returned. To this day, I can't explain what I saw, but I'll never forget the feeling of that glare, and I've never looked at that old farmhouse the same way again. Story 7. When I was a kid, my uncle and I were finishing up chopping and gathering firewood for my grandmother as the sun was setting. It was getting dark quickly, so we loaded up the truck and started heading back to her house along a dirt road, driving at about 30 miles per hour, maybe a little faster. As we drove, an uneasy feeling crept over me, a heavy, almost suffocating sense that we were being watched. Before I could turn to look out the passenger side window to see if someone or something was there, my uncle abruptly shouted, "Don't." His tone was sharp and full of urgency, which froze me in place. My heart felt like it was trying to pound its way out of my chest, but then it stopped completely when I heard a soft, deliberate tap against my window. My uncle pressed harder on the gas, speeding up, and began loudly praying in Navajo. I didn't understand what was happening, but the fear in his voice terrified me even more. Just as I thought it might be over, the truck lurched downward as if something heavy had jumped into the bed. At that moment, my uncle's voice became even more commanding. "Look at me. Don't turn away," he said repeatedly, his voice steady but strained. I could feel tears welling up as I struggled to breathe. And then I heard it again. Tap, tap, this time on the rear window behind me. My entire body felt cold, and I wanted to cry, but I didn't dare move or look back. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a minute or two, the truck lurched again, as if the weight in the bed had suddenly lifted. My uncle immediately glanced around and let out a deep, relieved sigh. The air seemed to shift, and it grew quieter, save for the steady hum of the truck and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. He finally broke the silence, his voice calm but serious. "We will ask your father to do a prayer in the morning, so the evil will forget our faces." That's the closest translation I can give from Navajo to English. I curled up on the seat, too scared to even glance out the windows. Instead, I focused on the truck's radio, watching the clock tick forward minute by minute, as if time itself might protect me. My uncle began singing an old prayer, his voice steady and rhythmic, filling the cab with a strange sort of comfort. We made it back to my grandmother's house safely, but that night stayed with me. Even now, I can still hear the tap-tap sound and feel the weight of that unshakable presence from the darkness. Story 8. When I was a park ranger in New York City, I supervised an endangered species nesting area on Rockaway Beach in Queens. The job involved monitoring piping plovers and least terns, which were under constant threat from predatory gulls and human activity. The nesting area stretched about a mile from the boardwalk to the shoreline, and a sand dune obscured the view of the beach from the boardwalk. It was challenging work, made even harder by the area's tough reputation, a mix of beachfront condos and sprawling housing projects rife with crime and gang activity. My team consisted of 2 other supervisors and 8 seasonal workers, most of whom were great. But every year, there was one problem employee who made things worse for everyone. This particular summer, that person was a woman who barely showed up, calling out sick or simply skipping work more often than not. After 3 weeks of her working only 3 days a week, she started complaining about her broken beach umbrella, demanding a replacement. Frustrated, I told her, "I'll get you a new umbrella when you work 5 days a week like the rest of us." This led to a public meltdown where she claimed she was too upset to continue working. I warned her that if she left, her job would be gone when she came back. She finished the day in silence, but the fallout came quickly. Over the next 2 days while I was off, my co-supervisors encountered her boyfriend, a recently released Blood Gang member. Furious over what he saw as my disrespect toward his girlfriend, he threatened to kill me. He knew my routine, where I parked, where I ate lunch, and the areas I patrolled. He warned that if I fired her, he'd find me in the middle of the nesting site, shoot me, and leave me to die, far from help. When I came back to work, I showed up in a bulletproof vest, filed a police report, and fired her anyway. From that day on, my life at work changed completely. I spent the rest of the summer in the truck, avoiding the isolated nesting areas where I'd be vulnerable. I started parking in different locations and drove to a distant part of the beach for lunch. My paranoia skyrocketed. I didn't know what the guy looked like. All I had was his name and a description from my co-workers. Gunshots were a regular sound in Rockaway, and people were killed there weekly. My staff advised me to never be alone, and I took their advice. The work suffered. I couldn't monitor the piping plovers effectively, and at the end of the season, none of their chicks had survived. The least terns, nesting closer to the boardwalk, had a successful year. But I couldn't shake the frustration of what we'd lost. Armed only with pepper spray and a baton, I spent every sweltering day in my vest, constantly looking over my shoulder. That summer, I learned how thin the line between duty and danger could be, and how paranoia can reshape your entire life. It was a season I'll never forget. Story 9. When I was about 10 years old, my family and I were staying at a nice hotel. One morning, we headed down to breakfast, and as soon as I got there, I realized I'd forgotten my bag in the room, so I decided to head back up and grab it. I got into the elevator alone, and everything seemed normal, and it wasn't. About halfway up, a beeping sound started. At first, I thought it was just the usual elevator noises, but then the entire thing began to shudder violently. Suddenly, it stopped completely. The lights dimmed, flickered, and then went out entirely, plunging me into darkness. I pressed the emergency button, but nothing happened. No response. And that beeping, it just kept going. Beep, beep, beep. I yelled, screamed, and banged on the elevator doors, hoping someone outside would hear me. But there was nothing. Just me, the darkness, and that relentless, maddening beeping. In my young mind, I was sure this was it. I was convinced I'd be stuck in there forever, that no one would ever find me, and I'd starve to death in this cold metal box. After what felt like an eternity, though, it was probably about an hour, the elevator suddenly jolted back to life. The lights flickered back on, and it began to move. When the doors finally opened, I bolted out of there as fast as I could. It turned out there had been some kind of engineering issue, nothing more. But even now, years later, I can't forget the panic of being trapped in there. That damn beeping still haunts me. To this day, I can't stand the sound of a microwave timer, and if I have the option, I'll almost always take the stairs. Story 10. I live in Florida, and my family has always been big into fishing. We own a 22-foot open fisherman boat, and one day we decided to head about 50 miles offshore to fish for grouper. The day was going great, perfect weather, calm seas, and plenty of fish biting. As the day wore on and it was time to head back, we discovered the boat wouldn't start. One of the spark plugs had gone bad, and unfortunately, we didn't have a spare. For those who don't fish offshore often, let me tell you, it gets unsettling. You lose sight of the shore at around 7 to 12 miles out, and we were 50 miles from land. There wasn't another boat in sight, since it was a quiet Wednesday and our cell phones had lost service miles ago. To make matters worse, we couldn't reach anyone on the marine radio either. There was only one option left: the little red distress button on the radio. It's something you only push when you're in real trouble. My dad hesitated, but eventually had no choice but to press it. Almost immediately, the Coast Guard responded on the radio. My dad explained that we were safe, didn't need medical attention, but our boat was dead in the water. To our surprise, they told us they were conducting drills for new recruits and would send a crew out to assist us. Within 20 minutes, we spotted one of those low-flying Coast Guard planes in the distance, followed by a helicopter that passed directly overhead. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably about 20 more minutes, the helicopter hovered over our boat. Finally, we saw a rescue boat speeding toward us. Even though we weren't in a life-threatening situation, everything was treated like a real emergency. Watching the Coast Guard in action, with the plane, the helicopter, and the rescue boat, was both awe-inspiring and reassuring. It turned a stressful moment into an unforgettable experience, and I'll never forget how quickly they came to our aid. Story 11. About a month ago, I was out with some friends smoking weed. We were passing around a bowl, getting pretty high. Then one of them offered something they called synthetic marijuana. They said it would just get me really high, like normal weed, and not to worry about it. I was already baked, so I didn't question it and took a hit. At first it seemed fine, but then I started getting higher and higher. Soon I could feel this strange sensation moving through my arms and legs. Somehow, I had this irrational certainty that if I let it get in, I wouldn't be able to move them. I tried to fight it, but eventually I lost. My arms and legs went limp, and then I realized I couldn't move anything at all. I was completely paralyzed. I could still see, hear, and feel everything around me if my eyes happened to be open, but I had no control over my body. Then things got worse. My thoughts began to break down. Every time I tried to think something, it stopped making sense. If I thought, I can't understand this, that thought itself would collapse into nonsense. Memories, ideas, everything unraveled in the most horrifying way. I felt a deep, primal terror as my mind betrayed me. I knew something was terribly wrong, but even that knowledge seemed to disintegrate into confusion. My friends tried to wake me up, but they were too high to understand what was happening. Eventually, they panicked and called my parents. My dad came to meet us and found me limp in the passenger seat of the car, my eyes open but blank, completely unresponsive. I could vaguely sense him there and managed to shift my eyes toward him once or twice, but that was all I could do. He called an ambulance, and the paramedics arrived to take me to the hospital. They didn't realize I was awake. They gave me an IV, which I could feel but couldn't react to. Then a trainee paramedic attempted to place a second IV, jabbing my other arm repeatedly. He couldn't get it, and by the end of it, my arm was so bruised that the entire area turned yellow for days. I managed to slightly bend my arm to stop him from trying again. At the hospital, my friends lied and told the staff that we had been playing outside and I had probably overheated. The doctors started cooling me down with ice packs and cold water, completely unaware that I had been in air conditioning all day and was already cold by nature. I couldn't shiver or communicate to tell them they were making it worse. After about an hour of being freezing cold, I began to regain some control. I could nod slightly in response to questions. The nurses noticed and started asking me directly, instead of relying on my parents. Eventually, they figured out what had happened. I had smoked K2. It turned out that K2 isn't synthetic marijuana at all. It's a designer drug, essentially weeds, sprayed with undisclosed chemicals, often imported from China, and sold at gas stations as incense. The nurses explained that they had seen many people come in after smoking K2. Some recover without problems, others leave with long-term issues, and many don't survive at all. It took me about 8 hours to regain full movement in my extremities, and another 4 hours before I could talk again. The experience was horrifying, and I'll never forget it. I was lucky to come out of it alive. Story 12. Over the long Memorial Day weekend, I did what many Americans do. I went camping. This trip was not just a casual getaway, it felt deeply necessary. Late Wednesday morning, I packed my gear, waiting for Chuck, a close friend of my wife and me, to pick me up. We had been planning this trip for months, and I was excited to finally disconnect. Our destination was Little Paint Campground near Yellow River in Marquette, Iowa. Marquette sits at the northeastern edge of the state, bordering Wisconsin and Minnesota. The campground, nestled deep in a heavily wooded valley, offered no electrical or water hookups, no cell service, and a rugged atmosphere perfect for roughing it. At night, the darkness was almost tangible, with only campfires and flashlights cutting through the pitch-black surroundings. Coyotes howled in the distance, and rumors of mountain lions added an extra edge to the already wild environment. Chuck and I set up camp, gathered firewood, and spent the evening around the fire, sharing stories and solving the world's problems, as you do on such trips. Later that night, Chuck's brother, Shannon, arrived with his 13-year-old son, Ryan, for a father-son fishing outing. It was shaping up to be a memorable trip. The next morning, Shannon and Ryan went fishing, while Chuck and I took our time preparing for the day. They returned with 3 trout, and Shannon decided to clean and prepare them by the stream. As I sat reading at the campsite, I suddenly saw Chuck sprinting toward me, panic written across his face. "Shannon got hurt," he said, his voice shaking. He stabbed himself with the fillet knife. While cleaning the fish, Shannon had forgotten to sheathe the knife and accidentally sank it deep into his upper thigh, severing the femoral artery. Blood began pouring out immediately. Chuck had the presence of mind to apply a tourniquet with his belt, but the bleeding was severe. I grabbed a roll of paper towels and rushed to help. When I got to Shannon, he was standing with his pants down, hands pressing desperately on the wound. Blood spurted out in a terrifying arc when he let go. I shoved the towels against the wound, trying to staunch the flow, while Chuck brought his truck around. We managed to lift Shannon 6 feet 1 inch and 270 pounds into the truck bed. I climbed in with him, applying pressure and holding the tourniquet as Chuck drove like a madman toward the top of the hill, where we might get a cell signal. At the top, Chuck called 911, but was disconnected mid-call. Unsure of what to do, we stopped at the main intersection of a tiny town, hoping the dispatcher had enough information to find us. As we waited, I kept talking to Shannon to keep him from going into shock, all while applying pressure to his gushing wound. My hands, arms, and sneakers were soaked in his blood, and the metallic stench was overwhelming. Finally, a volunteer first responder arrived, followed by the ambulance. The paramedics worked quickly to stabilize Shannon and rushed him to the nearest hospital, with Chuck and me speeding behind them. A county sheriff, seeing the situation, fell in behind us and allowed us to speed. Despite losing nearly 5 pints of blood, half the body's total Shannon made it to the hospital alive. He was later transferred to a larger hospital in Iowa City, where surgeons repaired the damage to his artery and its branches. Against all odds, he survived and was scheduled for release just days later. That night at the campsite, the mood was somber. Ryan, who had seen his father loaded into the truck, was understandably shaken, but found some humor later, saying we must have looked ridiculous, driving out with Shannon's legs propped up in the truck bed, and me leaning over him, hands deep in his groin to stop the bleeding. Looking back, so many things could have gone wrong, but fate seemed to guide us. If Chuck and I had gone to get firewood, Shannon would have been alone with his son, unable to stop the bleeding. If we had turned the wrong way out of the campsite, we would have been miles from help. Even Chuck's quick thinking with the tourniquet likely saved Shannon's life. As we reflected on the ordeal, Shannon, lying in the hospital bed, looked up at us with a weak smile and said, "Thanks for the ride." It was a moment of humor in an otherwise harrowing experience, one that I'll never forget. Story 13. When my twins were infants, waking up in the middle of the night was a regular occurrence. Often, one would wake up before the other for a feeding. One particular night, I woke up first, so I went into their room to feed her. Normally, B would wake up during the feeding, but this time, she stayed sound asleep. Once I finished feeding A and put her back in her crib, I noticed that B was still fast asleep. Not wanting to disturb A, who had just drifted back to sleep, I decided to check on B gently. I patted her back, softly, no movement. I shook her lightly, still nothing. Since she was swaddled, I couldn't see or hear her breathing, and panic started to set in. Terrified, I quickly picked her up, and as soon as I did, her eyes popped open, and she started crying. I've never been so relieved to hear that sound. My heart was racing, but everything was fine. She had just been in a very deep sleep. It was one of the scariest moments of my life. Then there was another time when B wasn't feeling well due to teething. I decided to cuddle with her on the couch to comfort her. My husband walked in, took one look, and said, "Jessica, you're bleeding." Confused, I glanced at my arm and noticed a significant amount of blood. I wiped it off but couldn't find any cuts or scratches on myself. Then my husband looked closer and said, "Oh wait, B's bleeding from her ear." Terror mode set in immediately. I saw blood coming from her ear and started preparing to take her to the ear. My mind raced with all the worst-case scenarios. That's when my husband took a closer look and noticed the blood wasn't coming from her ear canal. It was coming from a small scratch on the cartilage of her ear. She had scratched herself in her sleep. The relief I felt was indescribable, but it didn't stop my hands from shaking for a good while after. Parenthood has a way of keeping your heart in a constant state of overdrive. Story 14. January 2010. I was on my gap year between high school and university, heading to Mafia Island off the coast of Tanzania for a 3-month adventure. The journey to the island, however, turned into one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. After driving south for hours from Dar es Salaam, we arrived at the village where our boat was scheduled to depart around 8 p.m. The boat was meant to leave at 10 p.m., but like many things in Tanzania, the timing was approximate, and we didn't actually set off until 1 a.m. By the time we boarded, the boat was already packed with locals. It was clearly built to carry somewhere between 50 and 100 people, but had at least 150 on board before our group of 16 climbed aboard. People were lying down wherever they could, including on the roof alongside the luggage. I had to carefully step over several bodies just to find a seat next to a woman with a baby. The heat was oppressive, making the crowded conditions even more unbearable. As we departed, the boat's lights were turned off entirely. Someone explained that the captain navigated using the stars, as the boat had no navigation system. The darkness was complete. For about an hour, we cruised up an estuary, but as soon as we hit open water, the waves started. The boat began pitching steeply, climbing the waves at what felt like a 45-degree angle before crashing down again. Freezing seawater splashed over the sides and the bow, leaving me soaked and shivering. I could hear people crying, and every large wave elicited screams. Meanwhile, those on the roof, later described as having to tie themselves down to avoid being swept off, were enduring an even worse fate. The woman next to me moved her baby partially onto my lap, clutching my leg in terror. Then came the seasickness. All around me, people were vomiting due to the relentless rocking and the disorienting darkness. I joined in, leaning over the side of the boat, and though my friends tried to cheer me up by pointing out that my vomit was lighting up the bioluminescent plankton in the water, I was far from amused. Adding to my misery, I lost all my bottled water in the chaos, leaving me horribly dehydrated with 3 hours of the journey still ahead. Just when it seemed things couldn't get worse, the engine cut out. A faint smell of smoke reached my nose, and panic began to ripple through the passengers. People at the back surged toward the front, crushing into me as we all waited in tense silence. For about 20 agonizing minutes, no one knew what was happening. When the engine finally sputtered back to life, we learned later that a fire had broken out in the engine room, but was luckily extinguished before it could spread. That knowledge only deepened the sinking feeling I had throughout the journey several times. I was convinced I wouldn't make it. After what felt like an eternity, we finally reached Mafia Island. Though the journey was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, the time I spent on the island was unforgettable and filled with incredible memories. Needless to say, when it came time to return, I didn't hesitate to fork out the extra £65 for a flight back to the mainland. It was the best money I ever spent. Story 15. Background info. I have a mild case of narcolepsy, which makes me prone to falling asleep in certain environments, especially classrooms, or even while driving. Over the years, I've developed techniques to fight it, off rolling down windows, slapping my face, blasting music, but there have been close calls. Sometimes, I've driven hundreds of miles in a state so close to sleep that I barely remember the journey. Adding to the confusion, I have vivid, realistic dreams where I often can't tell I'm dreaming. This story happened after I drove 5 hours to my parents' house. I was sitting in their big, comfy computer chair, working on an online college course. It didn't take long for that familiar wave of drowsiness to hit. My eyelids felt impossibly heavy. I couldn't keep them open no matter how hard I tried. Next thing I knew, I was in my car, driving on a highway at night, a scenario all too familiar. My eyes were drooping, head nodding. I fought it as usual, slapping my face, rolling down the windows to feel the cool air. But despite my best efforts, I felt myself slipping. Suddenly, I nodded off. I woke up back in the computer chair. My head jerked forward, and I thought, wait, was I dreaming about being in a car? Before I could process it, I slipped back into sleep, and I was back in the car. My hands gripped the wheel as I muttered, was I just dreaming I was in a computer chair? I slapped my face harder, rolled down the windows again. The cool air hit me, and I felt slightly more awake, but the glow of the brake lights ahead began pulling me into the abyss. My head nodded again. I was back in the computer chair. My heart was racing. Which is the dream, I thought, panic rising. The chair or the car? Then I was back in the car. I questioned reality again, thinking, I can't fall asleep and find out the hard way. I stayed hyper-focused, determined to stay awake. But no matter what I did, slapping my face, blasting cold air, I felt my willpower waning. After what felt like an hour of battling sleep, I made a decision. The car has to be the dream, I told myself. I'll just let go. So, I nodded off. I woke up in a hospital bed. Chaos surrounded me. My first thought was, holy shit, the car wasn't the dream. My worst fear had come true. I must have fallen asleep at the wheel and crashed. There were people standing over me, urgently shouting, stay with us, stay with us. We need you to stay awake. I tried, but I couldn't fight the heaviness dragging me under. My eyelids closed again, and I thought, is this it? Am I dying? I snapped awake, back in the computer chair. My heart was pounding as I leapt up, knocking the chair over. I ran my hands through my hair, breathing heavily. What the fuck just happened? Even now, I'm not entirely sure which part was real, if any. It still feels like I was trapped in a looping nightmare that blurred the lines between dream and reality. And that's it for tonight's collection of real-life scares. If these stories sent shivers down your spine, or if they reminded you of your own close calls, don't forget to subscribe to Panda's Nightmares. For more haunting and gripping tales, hit the like button, follow for updates, and check out my other videos for even more spine-chilling stories. Before you go, if you can, please consider supporting my dad's medical treatment through the GoFundMe link in the description. Your kindness and generosity mean so much to me. Thank you for watching, and remember, the scariest stories are the ones that actually happened. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.